I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. As always, we have a great roundup of topics for you today. We're going to start with Will, who will cover Israel's invasion of Rafah, as Hamas has said that they accepted a ceasefire that apparently Israel did not even know was being negotiated. Then we'll go to Ben, who can walk us through the Infowar behind the campus craziness in terms of the protests that have been taking place over the past few weeks. Inez will talk about Congress passing an anti-Semitism bill that has a lot of free speech advocates quite concerned. And then I'll close us out with news about the Democratic National Convention coming up in Chicago and how the Democratic politicians there are trying to avoid negative headlines related to migrants. So with that, I will kick it over to Will to start us off.
So yeah, Israel has now moved into Rafah. They have operational control of the Rafah border crossing, which they managed to achieve within a couple hours, I believe, of crossing back into Gaza. What's been happening for the last few months, most of the IDF has been out of Gaza. They've only had like one brigade holding a narrow corridor that cut Gaza in half from north to south. And so, you know, there's been some worry that like, oh, they've withdrawn, they can't go back. And people forget that Gaza is about the size of Las Vegas. And most of these troops are only, you know, the moment they want to go back into Gaza, well, it's, you know, they get in the car and they drive half an hour. So it's never been a big deal. But anyway, they control Gaza. Or I'm sorry, they control the Rafah checkpoint, and they've begun operations in Rafah. This despite Hamas managing to agree to a ceasefire with itself. Hamas announced that it had, you know, was willing to agree to the Qatari and Egyptian ceasefire proposal, but that proposal was not actually. I'm not even sure the Israelis saw it, or if they did, it had multiple parts that were totally unacceptable to them. You know, just kind of give you a sense of how this hostage negotiation went. For a while, they were asking for 40 living hostages. Hamas said, oh, well, we don't have 40 in the categories you're looking for. Then the number was 33. And not only then, when this final agreement that Hamas assented to will return 33 hostages alive or dead. It's just like, what are we even doing here, guys? You're insane and ridiculous. That hasn't stopped, obviously, everybody from saying, oh my God, it's genocide. It's patently absurd. I mean, you know, it's just for a wide variety of reasons. And I think, honestly, it's a really interesting political dynamic for the Biden administration, because I've thought for quite some time that they made a huge mistake just politically by trying to stall this war out for so long, because the continuation of the war is just terrible for the Biden administration. It always will be, because it's a wedge for their base. They have a huge chunk of their base that is effectively pro-Hamas, and then a good chunk of their base and their donors are pro-Israel. And they can't really navigate that. The best thing that would to happen to Biden politically would be for the war to be just over. Even if Israel won it entirely, it would just be for the war to be over so people could forget about it and the news cycle could move on. But they've been stalling it for months. And the fact that Israel could snap its fingers and take the Rafah crossing just sort of indicates like this didn't need to drag on so long. I mean, you know, Israel's been waiting because the U.S. has been putting pressure on them to have super formal plans for humanitarian aid and please accept this ceasefire deal. I mean, the U.S. has been stall, and Israel's been like just waiting. But really, this war could have been over 4 months ago had the United States just let it happen. So I don't know what you guys think, but I'm glad to see that Israel's in Rafah. It's absolutely necessary to take out these final Hamas battalions, and we'll see what happens going forward.
So I'll be the voice of pessimism here and raise a couple issues. One of which is that despite the fact that this was characterized as the Qatari-Egyptian deal with Hamas, it really appears that the Biden administration was in large part behind it. And the PR or messaging part of this was, look, Hamas agreed to a ceasefire. Now Israel is finally engaging in this aggressive action in Rafah to win the war. And obviously, destroying Hamas's battalions in Rafah is essential to winning the war. On the Biden administration side, the reason they couldn't allow for a quick Israeli win, a decisive win, is because that ran up against the objective of realigning the Middle East towards an Iran-dominated, which means Hezbollah, Houthi, and Hamas-dominated Middle East. And so the extending and prolonging of the war was meant to put pressure on Israel, essentially, to force Israel to lose at the end of the day. And then with the proviso that, well, the Biden administration would turn it into a win by having normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which was conditioned upon Israel recognizing the creation of what would be a Palestinian terror state, which would ultimately eliminate Israel, thereby neutralizing the normalization and rendering it moot. Part of the I think some of the thought process behind forcing the prolonging of the war beyond pressuring Israel to come to some kind of disastrous deal where they trade 20 or 30 or more times as many jihadists for hostages, however many of which remain, is that it would obviously put pressure on Netanyahu and potentially topple the government, which is also part of the objective, because if you get Netanyahu out from the perspective of the Biden administration, then you get a more left-wing Israeli leadership, which is going to be more amenable to the creation of a Palestinian terrorist state. So obviously, my view is probably the minority view as to what's going on. But if you look also, the administration, we've just learned, has been threatening to withhold weapons resupply for Israel, while it demands that Israel continue to provide quote unquote aid, all of which is commandeered by Hamas, even after jihadists slaughter 4 IDF soldiers in the last few days. And all of this, of course, up against Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, where the administration talks about never again. It talks about the imperative to remember the 6 million Jews who were slaughtered, but of course, tries to universalize the message when in the official White House statement, it then talks about the LGBTQ community targeted by the Nazis and other groups as well. But the words ring totally hollow in terms of never again when you don't let Israel eliminate a jihadist threat, a Nazi threat, a modern day Nazi threat. And to add just a little bit more cynicism to the equation, it's also worth noting that part of the justification for delaying the Israeli assault, the Israeli incursion in Gaza in the first place, and also that the Biden administration has used to micromanage the entire effort, which has prevented Israel from winning decisively to date, is the quote unquote humanitarian crisis. But that crisis, to the extent there is one, is a crisis of Biden's making. The Biden administration explicitly would not let Palestinian Arabs be evacuated from Gaza into the Sinai in Egypt or emigrate to other countries during the war. They called that quote unquote forced displacement. They would have called that quote unquote ethnic cleansing. We had substantial leverage, we being the US, over Egypt to push Egypt to accept refugees during the pendency of the war, and didn't, consequently creating a propaganda coup for Hamas whenever non-combatants were killed, and also tying Israel's hands so that Israel couldn't do the job it needed to do as easily, given the collateral damage concerns. So it's disgusting, cynical, and outrageous from start to finish, in my view. And let's hope Israel finishes the job, in spite of the fact that the Biden administration has created a massive rupture between Israel and the US that is going to persist for years beyond the current conflict.
Yeah, just to underscore Ben's point about essentially not allowing the Palestinians to lose a war. And there is a real, even from the humanitarian perspective, which I'll be honest, I don't find that to be even in the, top several concerns in this war, especially given who started the war. I don't think that's the way that nations should be thinking about war. But even if one were to take the humanitarian perspective, there's a real question as to whether not allowing the Palestinians to actually lose the many wars at this point, and then have to confront the fact that they have lost those wars in the form of course, massive aid coming a large part from the West and from the United States, but also internationally propping up essentially of this Palestinian cause with both rhetoric, as well as like with hard cash, cold hard cash that allowed Hamas to build most of those London Underground-esque tunnels underneath Gaza. There's a real question as to whether that's even on the humanitarian basis, is that humanitarian? As Ben just pointed out, right? I mean, the reason that this persists as this intractable conflict is because one side has launched a series of wars, essentially lost every single one, and then the international community has not allowed the consequences of that loss to perpetuate. And I don't know. I think there's a real question as to whether that's, I mean, even from the narrow perspective of what is that good for Palestinians, I don't think so. It's, you know, at no point have they had to confront the question of their identity or what kind of lives they want to live, because they have lost, like, in light of the fact that they have lost and they will not retake the territory that, I mean, from the river to the sea, they want the whole territory and the annihilation of Israel. That's not a goal that Israel is obviously going to allow them to succeed in. And so, like, the fact that the international community continues to pretend that that's a possible goal and back them on that behalf, maybe for all their cynical reasons, but it's not actually good for the people who are wasting their lives doing so. Just a couple brief points. One, Ben's point about arms shipments should highlight once again, and I know we've mentioned this on this podcast before, there is a West-wide arms problem. So those shipments are very necessary, meaning Israel can't, you know, continue to supply the front, in all reports, cannot continue to supply the front without help from the United States. And that's not unusual. And in fact, the United States is cutting quite deeply into its own supply between supplying Ukraine and Israel. Now, I know that some people will say, well, then we should, you know, end our commitments abroad. To me, this is a 5-alarm fire saying, well, why can't we supply? I mean, these are not extraordinary wars, right? If we can't supply these two wars, we definitely can't supply our own war against China. I mean, this is like, and this is a Western-wide problem. I mean, European countries are also running out of armaments. It's something that in any sane country, which we obviously aren't, would be a, you know, five alarm, like, this is a massive problem. We don't have the ability to go to war in a serious way. And then finally, in terms of the future of peace in the Middle East, there is a very interesting poll that just came out that shows that essentially support for a two-state solution within Israel is cabined to people who are above 60, who are more than twice as likely than people 30 and below to believe in the future of a two-state solution. So, you know, the Biden administration still clings to that. There's some reporting that the Trump administration may abandon that even as a formal position, but it has been effectively abandoned within Israel, which is a reality that anybody who wants to negotiate that is going to have to deal with.
I'll just be very brief and say that what the Biden administration is reported to have done with this latest attempt at a ceasefire is incredibly dastardly. The reports indicate that the Biden administration was indeed presenting something to Hamas that had not been presented to or negotiated with the Israeli government. And so they basically intentionally put pressure on their ally to accept something that they had no hand in negotiating by giving this deal over to Hamas, allowing Hamas to publicly accept it. Of course, it's basically a Hamas wish list. And then Israel looks like the bad guy for rejecting the latest ceasefire offer. And then Biden turns around and talks about how he'll never abandon support for Israel and has this whole parade around fighting anti-Semitism on Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's obviously just a show from his part at this point. He keeps trying to have it both ways by acquiescing to his progressive anti-Israel base while trying to still win the support of pro-Israel Jews and perhaps older members of the Democratic Party. And in doing so, he's turned out to be an incredibly feckless leader on this foreign policy question, and has actually made the situation far, far worse. And with that, I will go to Ben to talk about the links between Hamas and the riotous, rowdy campus protests that we've been seeing over the past month or so.
Yeah, so a few days ago, before we recorded, we're recording on Tuesday, the 7th, Politico came out with a headline which could have been a parody. Pro-Palestinian protesters are backed by a surprising source, Biden's biggest donors. And the subheadline was, some of the most outspoken groups against Biden and Israel get funding from foundations attached to some of the biggest names in Democratic circles. And the organizations involved include the likes of the Tides Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, organizations that have been funded by the likes of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Pritzkers, George Soros, and many others as well. And I think that Park McDougall has written probably the defining piece at Tablet, where he talks about something which there's sort of the dichotomy involved in all of the campus occupations in the country and really the broader pro-Hamas rallies that we've seen since October 7th and agitation we've seen since October 7th, which goes beyond just the encampments to actual activist action, impeding and obstructing people going about their lives in the streets, trying to disrupt commerce, threatening and menacing innocent Americans and beyond, where on the one hand, on the campuses, yes, you have the dupes and the useful idiots who, many of whom don't even understand the slogans that they're chanting, the significance of it, the history behind it, the fact that they are in league with jihadists and modern day Nazis. But on the other hand, the movements themselves and the actual activism, the talking points, the consistency of the rallies, the fact that these occupations sprung up in the way that they did in a very concerted fashion speaks to the fact that there is substantial orchestration of the events, cooperation. These are professional operations that are well resourced. And there are groups that have been perfecting these activities and strategies really for decades. And these should be thought of as one continuous link in the chain that goes from Occupy Wall Street to the Black Lives Matter riots, and now to the campus encampments. And Park McDougall, I think, lays this out in a really comprehensive piece at Tablet, where he shows that the leftist groups on the one hand and Islamist groups on the others, who have been part of an intersectional so-called alliance, have been working hand in glove behind the activism that we've seen on the campuses, and that they're backed again by these always left-wing tied and oftentimes billionaire-backed groups who, through these sorts of interesting charitable structures, interesting is one way to put it, another way is opaque and layered structures, are able to hide where the funding is and what the links and the ties are, the nexus between the left and the pro-Hamas protests and riots. And McDougall makes a really important point that I think is worth emphasizing. I'll read it just a bit from his piece. He says, it's a mistake both to view the campus protests as a student movement and to regard the outsiders as infiltrators or somehow separate from the movement. Rather, student activists have been working together with outsiders with whom they are linked via overlapping activist networks and nationwide organizations. The student revolts in turn, exist on a continuum with the broader anti-Israel protest movement. The campus encampments, for instance, began immediately after the nationwide economic blockade on April 15th, which saw protesters block the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and flood Wall Street in New York City. Flood, of course, being the operation, how Hamas referred to the operation on October 7th. Calls to participate in the A15 action were disseminated widely in anarchist and far-left networks, while Palestinian and Islamist groups, Students for Justice in Palestine, American Muslims for Palestine, CARE, and Within Our Lifetime, simultaneously called for an April 15th strike for Gaza. Given reporting that nationwide campus liberation zones and encampments were planned as early as November 2023, it seems likely that the timing of the university protest was decided by the movement well in advance. Building on that reporting, there have been two lawsuits recently that I think are worth raising to public attention to the extent they haven't gotten that much air. And that is that these groups referenced American Muslims for Palestine and Students for Justice in Palestine, which are sort of ubiquitous in these campus events. And specifically the Students for Justice in Palestine chapters lead the activism, for example, at Columbia and a slew of other campuses as well. There are two lawsuits out there raised by victims of October 7th and Hamas jihadism, alleging that essentially AMP and SJP are successor organizations to prior Hamas organizations, mouthpieces and activist organizations operating on U.S. soil. And basically what the lawsuits show is that in terms of the personnel involved in these organizations in terms of the aping of the rhetoric and even the tactics suggested by Hamas directly after October 7th, that there are links between the activism of these organizations, the ideology of the organizations, the personnel of these organizations, which show that essentially they represent Hamas's English language American mouthpiece propaganda organizations and are successor organizations to prior entities, namely including the Holy Land Foundation, which was the primary player in the largest terrorism financing prosecution in U.S. history, that these are their successor organizations. And so they go through in these lawsuits kind of the links and the ties in terms of the, again, the propaganda, the rhetoric, the action suggested. I'll read briefly from one of the complaints. It says, defendants' encouragements of its members, affiliates, and allies to join the resistance, a euphemism for Hamas, is not mere speech or advocacy. Rather, defendants encourage their members to exert political pressure on American institutions and politicians in service of Hamas's goals. The chaotic images emerging from American campuses are the intended results of defendants' endeavors. Defendants act as Hamas's public relations division and recruit domestic foot soldiers not only to disseminate Hamas's propaganda, but also to foment violence, chaos, and fear across the U.S. to intimidate citizens and coerce change in American policy. This is all in support of Hamas's short and long-term goals for its international terrorist activities. And we've seen that because we've seen Hamas officials, as well as officials from Iran's malocracy, come out and cheer on the protesters in America. It's worth noting the executive director, I found this out by doing some sleuthing, executive director of American Muslims for Palestine, which is the key organization, and Students for Justice in Palestine is sort of its campus arm, visited with the Biden administration last year in 2023 as part of Arab American Heritage Month. He has been tied to Hamas in several different ways, including through one of those organizations cited in the Holy Land Foundation prosecution. And I guess I'll leave with this message. Last year, Jonathan Shanzer of FDD testified before Congress, and he noted that he testified on two separate occasions, noting how American Muslims for Palestine was spawned by individuals who previously worked for nonprofits, shuttered by federal authorities, or sued in civil court because they provided financial or material support to Hamas. When I testified in 2016, legislators exhibited an interest. So did federal law enforcement. However, one official candidly told me that suspected Hamas activists in the United States were viewed then as protected sources in the fight against the Islamic State terrorist group. Also worth noting that Iranian proxies were viewed as essential in the U.S. effort to combat the Islamic State terrorist group. So where does this leave all of us? Well, I think short term, it's very clear that the Americans reject and find repugnant the campus activism, the violence, the intimidation. I'm not sure how abreast the public is of the fact that these Hamas-linked groups are the ones organizing and coordinating and orchestrating much of this activity. But long term, there's a broader issue of what do you make of the fact that the Democrat Party, its billionaire donors, and these organizations have developed these sophisticated mechanisms to activate these campuses to effectively wage information warfare on behalf of Hamas. I leave it to the group for kind of your takeaways about what I've laid out, and then also the short and long-term political and then substantive consequences.
Yeah, just as briefly as possible. First, I mean, this is not new, this organization and collaboration that is essentially like the street arm of the street protest / violence arm of the Democratic Party and of the left. It is more like a rotating carousel of which victimhood group is, sort of on top and the tip of the spear in terms of the messaging at any given moment. It was Summer of Floyd. Now it's going to be Summer of Hamas. All of this infrastructure and these various organizations that Ben laid out, and I second his recommendation of Park McDougall's piece and Tablet laying this out. All of this organization, I mean, the word intersectional does actually apply to the left. In that sense, and this is not like new infrastructure. It just gets applied to the message of the day. Nor is the content of the message, by the way, new. This has been part of the campus activist left. When I was in college in 2010, exact same rhetoric, right? It just wasn't at the forefront of the protest at that time. It would just bubble up with, whatever SJP was doing in Apartheid Week or whatever. It really does seem like they seize on whatever the issue of the day really is. And you can see this by how few of the activists at any given time know anything about the issue, and yet they are organized and out on the street, and potentially, committing illegal acts on behalf of this. So it really is more organized and more flexible and more intersectional than a lot of people realize if they're responding to the concrete, Middle Eastern issues. That's not really what's at stake here, at least domestically. The second thing is that's why it's dumb to treat the campuses, I think, or at least counterproductive, to treat the campuses as antagonistic to the protesters, as I've seen some people do. Yes, they will be temporarily antagonistic, but ultimately this is exactly what the campuses have been, training these students for more than a decade. It's a little inconvenient for them right now, and so there's a temporary left on left fight here that I tend to think, as Chris Rufo has said, it's strategically wise for the right to just allow to happen, while very vigorously enforcing the law, both against universities themselves, which we'll get to in my segment, and second, as soon as people step foot off campus and start to inconvenience people. And we're right to say, this is not really a campus movement. This is basically the same movement that flows on and off campus. And you see that really clearly in New York City, where that movement just basically, it's not really located. It was temporarily located in Columbia, but it has been popping up in different parts of the city and breaking laws in different parts of the city and inconveniencing people and closing bridges and all that. And I would be surprised if it doesn't continue through the summer, even when the students mostly go home, with a slightly different composition. So finally, just as a point of laughter, Politico puts this headline out on the information that Ben just put. Pro-Palestine protesters are backed by a surprising source, Biden's biggest donors. Only somebody who completely doesn't understand any of the contours of what's actually going on would be surprised by this.
Yeah, extraordinarily quickly, there's a very interesting document put out that by, I forget exactly who, but Dave Riavoy retweeted it. But it's a document put out at Pomona College, which shows the detail, rules and community guidelines that these campers operate under, clearly evidence that there's this significant national coordination and preparation for all these events, something that we don't have on the right. So this is one of the reasons we can't do protests like this. And also just a general indication of why, when we get Trump back in, we should be looking at criminal prosecutions for all these people.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think you all covered it. So we will just move over to Inez to talk about the anti-Semitism bill that so far, I believe, has just passed the House of Representatives, and will be brought up in the Senate this week.
Yeah, speaking of an inadequate response to everything that we just talked about in the last segment, that's what this bill is. First, I want to lay out what it's not, because I think there is a lot of genuine confusion, because you see pieces of the definition that they cite from an outside organization in this bill floating around about what is and is not anti-Semitic, and there's the impression that those views or expressing those views are criminalized in this bill. It isn't. So the predicate in this bill is attempting essentially to make sure that Title VI applies to Jewish students on campus. I'll get to why I think it's completely unproductive in a moment, but I just want to, first deal with what's actually in the bill. So the predicate is always action that rises to something under Title VI. So, targeted harassment of Jewish students, threats, preventing people from attending classes on the basis of their Jewish background. Those are all the predicates. And then in order to qualify for Title VI as discrimination on the basis that would ultimately, the consequence there would be that university, if tolerating that kind of behavior, would be ineligible for federal funds. So there's an action predicate. So the definition only comes into play after there's one of these actions, right? So you can still say all the blatantly anti-Semitic things you want. That's protected speech in the United States. Nothing in this bill changes that. And actually, Will rightly pointed out on Twitter, and I'm sure he'll point out here, there's a Trump EO that does much the same thing as this bill. There's the reason that people push this is because there's some question. I tend to think that this is not actually the problem, but legally, but in any case, there's some question about whether discrimination on the basis of race applies to Jews or doesn't apply to Jews, because there is a complication of what are Jews? Are they a religion? Are they a people? Are they an ethnicity? Right? Like, and so there is some like contrary case law, and I think that's the impetus for this bill. That being said, I mean, the primary problem I have with this bill is that it represents two things. One, a completely ineffective sort of virtue signaling response that focuses only on the anti-Semitic aspect of these protests. I mean, we just talked about how these protests are deeply intertwined, both with universities themselves and what they're producing in all elite networks in the United States, and with the infrastructure of the left and the activist left in the country. This bill does nothing about any of that, right? It makes it, at best, it makes it a little easier to sue under Title VI. There are already a bunch of Title VI lawsuits lined up against some of these universities. The reason that a lot of those complaints outside of the federal courts, but within the administrative system, are not moving is obviously because Biden's bureaucrats don't want to move racial complaints on the basis of Jews complaining about being prevented on the basis of being Jewish from attending classes. That's not the kind of case that the Biden administration bureaucrats are interested in dealing with. So to my mind, that's actually the primary problem here. We don't actually need to pass a whole law that confuses a lot of people to make this clear under the law. And Trump's EO, like I said, did much the same thing with much less fanfare. That being said, it's just not sufficient. Even though I support Title VI lawsuits, and I think just anything that we can do to make life uncomfortable for university administrations is worth doing. Ultimately, the consequences here have to be geared at the universities themselves that are heavily dependent, as we said many times on the show, like heavily dependent on federal money, on federal loans. We can demand basically any behavior of them on the penalty of pulling that money. They are completely dependent on that money. And I think we should be using this opportunity to make the case to the American people that they're wholly undeserving of that money and those special tax privileges and everything else that they hold. I think it's an opportune time to make that case to the American people. I think the American people are listening to that. The fact that Republicans keep pulling people in for these hearings on anti-Semitism, I think, is actually a good strategy to keep the spotlight on this. But sidetracking in sort of a separate deal, trying to deal specifically with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is just one of the natural and predictable consequences of this ideology. It's not the only consequence of this ideology. And, merely virtue signaling about anti-Semitism in Congress is not going to stop the underlying problem, which is ultimately both like just universities being essentially madrasas of left-wing activist thought that has always had the conclusion against Israel and Jews, but has also, has the animus against white Americans, against the U.S. itself. And my final thought we'll get into like the clearness of that. That we had an episode yesterday in New York City that just made that so crystal clear. I mean, this is a movement that will change its face for the next, the next leftist disruption and the next leftist, it was cause du jour. And so this bill is like very, very inadequate to actually addressing that institutional support that has made such a difference. And that's the reason I find it. In addition, it's confusing and people are just misquoting it online. But with that, I'll turn it over to the group.
Yeah, I have a take that I think I'm swimming upstream on this one because I've been like one of the only people saying this, but I thought there was this massive overreaction by the right to this bill. It was initially being characterized as some massive restriction of the anti-Semitic speech or a restriction on speech at all. And when I was reading about it on Twitter, I just assumed that people were characterizing it correctly. I read the bill. It's very narrow and limited and duplicative of something that's been done as described via executive order. And yet the entire right wing was rising up against it. I thought it was very bizarre. And I also thought it was bizarre because the primary antagonists to this bill in the past were the left, because they essentially what the bill does is just makes it a little easier to win a Title VI case against a university based on anti-Semitic discrimination. That's the effect of the bill. And the left was really upset about it because they see Title VI as their plaything, and they get to go after Republican and conservative students and students, universities that aren't doing enough about them. But they were seriously worried about what would happen if they, were suddenly liable for the actions of the stuffings that we're seeing on campuses right now. Now, I don't think the consequences are that great of this because, you know, as the Trump executive order did almost exactly the same thing using exactly the same language a few years ago. But I thought that the right wildly overreacted to it, which sort of triggers a question about whether there's this, because of the weird discourse online about Israel and the sort of effect of some of like the Groyper anti-Semitic types, that people are primed and influencers are primed to demonstrate that they are not, in fact, shilling for Israel or something, that they are instead just, they are balanced. And I mean, I assume most of them are, but I think it led them to eagerly jump on this as a way for them to demonstrate their credibility, that they are not, you know, quote unquote, shilling for Israel. But in reality, like the bill itself wasn't even that big a deal. And everybody kind of overreacted to it. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I suppose my biggest concern with the bill is that some of the things included in the definition of anti-Semitism could potentially strike against basically normal Christian speech. And so I think there is a question of whether or not Jewish students could bring Title VI complaints against either explicitly Christian universities or their Christian peers for some of the statements that were considered anti-Semitic. So that was my biggest concern with the bill. But I see Inez shaking their head, so maybe I misread it.
Yeah, I'll let Inez handle that one. I would just say I think this is sort of an all of the above issue. The International Holocaust, the IHRA definition, I do think is a useful definition. The question is, would you have an administration like this that would actually honor the Title VI concerns and the application of it? Highly dubious of that. I think that the critiques of this, despite the fact that on the one hand, you have legitimate concerns, obviously, about chilling speech when it comes to anything around how do you define bigotry, and then when does bigotry run up against civil rights of people. But on the other hand, I do think there's been a bad faith sort of propaganda operation, and I'll let Inez unpack that, to bat down this sort of definition in context of Title VI. But more broadly, I guess I would just say, we can obviously defend and protect our liberties with the laws that are on the books if they're applied properly. The tactic of having the hearings is certainly useful, but the broader systemic problem here is that the campuses are controlled by the left, totally dominated by the left, and the left has fomented Jew hatred, hatred of the Judeo-Christian West, and America hatred, and a political ideology that seeks to purge Americanism from American life at the end of the day. And so whether this is the most effective piece of legislation to get at that, I think is questionable. And whether, furthermore, Republicans, elected Republicans, understand the size, scope, and nature of the problem, and then what the most efficacious way is to combat it, I also think is in question at this point.
All right, and then I will just quickly share what Inez shared with me offline, because I think it's good context, which is that there has to be harassment as a predicate action. So just saying one of the supposedly anti-Semitic things that's listed in this bill would not be enough for a student to bring a Title VI complaint. So that's where that rub is. So helpful clarification for the viewers. And then I will bring it back to myself to go on a completely different topic than what we've been covering for the rest of the podcast, which is some of the actions that Chicago is apparently prepared to take in preparation for the Democratic National Convention, which is coming up in August. And this particular action, I don't think was supposed to get out, but a Democratic alderwoman actually sort of exposed the seediness and corruption of Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. So Chicago has been one of the cities that has received the buses of migrants from Texas. And so far, they've taken in somewhere between 30 and 40,000 migrants. Right now, they have 17 active shelters housing illegal aliens that contain something like 10,000 of them. I don't know where the rest are at this point. I guess not in shelters. But apparently, Mayor Brandon Johnson decided that ahead of the DNC They could not have illegal aliens in shelters downtown where the convention was actually going to be held, because that could, of course, lead to some pretty bad headlines for the Democrats, as they would be forced to confront their open borders policy as they see the squalor and the crime that is surrounding so many of these illegal alien encampments and shelters. So one of the shelters in the downtown area is pretty close to the Loop, which is a obviously pretty prominent tourist destination. It would probably be the site of a lot of people staying in hotels or going out during the convention. This shelter is 3 miles east of where the convention center is. The DNC is going to be held at the United Center. And Mayor Brandon Johnson sent a memo or a plan to this alderwoman in a ward on the south side of Chicago, letting her know that he was going to be moving all of the illegal aliens from this downtown shelter to a shelter in her ward. And she opposes this plan, naturally, because none of the Democrats want to deal with any of the consequences of their policies. And so she blasted Mayor Johnson publicly and exposed what he was trying to do in very blatantly moving these illegal aliens to protect the Democrats from the images of the migrant shelter basically next to the convention center. And she said in a statement, her name is Nicole Lee, she represents the 11th Ward, quote, "As our city grapples with this unprecedented influx of migrants, it is crucial that we handle the migrant crisis safely, responsibly, and with full transparency. The well-being of our communities must be the top priority. The administration has not provided us with an adequate justification for why this proposed relocation of migrants from the Standard Club shelter to this property is appropriate, necessary, or fiscally responsible." And in her larger statement, she explicitly mentioned that this was happening ahead of the DNC. So even she is aware of exactly why Mayor Johnson is doing this. She's aware of the fact that there's really no other justification for moving this shelter other than the optics of it being next to the convention center. I think it's kind of odd in some respects, at least from an optics perspective, that the Democrats chose Chicago to have their convention in the first place. They're, of course, trying to play up the fact that they are the working class Midwest party still. But Chicago, besides having this issue with the illegal aliens and the migrant shelters, they also have a serious crime problem. Over the weekend, there were a number of shootings that resulted in about 36 injuries, including 7 deaths from those shootings. Chicago is sort of the poster child for the Democrats' failed gun control policies. And it's also very well known as a very politically corrupt city as well. So they've chosen this complete Democratic haven that has all of these horrible knock-on effects from their policies to host their convention, and now are sort of trying to slip their way out of the obvious side-by-side of them having this big political event and the squalor and the crime and the fiscal irresponsibility that all of the citizens of Chicago actually have to deal with on a regular basis. So Mayor Johnson has just exposed that the Democrats are obviously aware of that contrast and are trying to avoid it by all means possible. Of course, they could have just avoided it by picking a different city in which to hold their convention. But there's going to be a very easy political ad for the Republicans to run after this convention happens, even if he is able to move this small group of illegal aliens. It obviously doesn't change the fact that Chicago, again, is still very much the epicenter of failed Democratic policies, and having the backdrop of the DNC there will be very, very telling. So I will open it up to the group for their thoughts on both the chosen location of the Democratic convention and then Mayor Johnson's blatantly political move in trying to export these illegal aliens from the downtown area to the south side.
Yeah, I watched, I was in Milwaukee in 2020 for the DNC convention, then doing a different event. But I got a taste of how militarized like the downtown area was, how fenced off it was. It was very clear that it was going to be extremely challenging to interrupt the DNC convention in any substantial way. and the city of Milwaukee really didn't want to be embarrassed. This was also COVID, so I think a lot of people would have been reluctant to go outside and do anything in any event. But the difference, I guess, in Chicago is it seems like the mayor of Chicago is more of the most radical left type and the kind of guy who might well just not be willing to put in place the kind of security necessary and disrupt the protesters. Because there were already reports that he was being reluctant about sending in the police to deal with the University of Chicago encampment. So I wouldn't be surprised if, these pro-Palestine protesters show up if Johnson takes the sides of the protesters against the DNC. It'd be really interesting to see. And I hope for as much chaos in Chicago as possible, because if you're a Republican, what are you even doing there? Like, leave.
I too am looking forward to the Democratic convention in Chicago. I am looking forward to it because it's going to be like 1968, except half the people inside the convention are going to be in support of the protesters outside, and I really can't wait to watch what this liberal mayor is going to do with, like, it seems to me that the only visuals possible coming out are either ones that will really tick off the entire leftist base, which is, shots of cops clearing out the protesters in front, shots of protests within the convention itself. And just, I never interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake. I look forward to this. And to take it to Amber's actual topic of moving these migrants. We actually have seen some municipal pushback. She quoted the woman representing the ward that is actually affected by this. You see the same thing in New York. You do see some actual pushback on the municipal level, even within the Democratic Party, because it is so unpopular. And once again, I do think this has some potential to transform the immigration issue nationally, now that the left is finally actually feeling, the left's constituencies are finally actually feeling at least some small measure of the pain of the immigration policies that until now they had very conveniently cabined to, towns along the Texas and Arizona border. And yeah, I think that is to the good, even though it means that I have a migrant shelter 3 blocks away from me.
I think that this topic illustrates a problem that really transcends the DNC this year, which is that you have the consequences of Democrat policies. They're hugely unpopular with the American people, but they're the natural consequence of what the ascendant progressive base in the Democrat Party wants. And it's sort of like you need the older, more establishment, liberal as opposed to illiberal cohort in the left party to essentially die off for the progressives to have completed their full hostile takeover. But what the convention is going to illustrate is, is there the will for the kind of stage management you would normally expect from the left to hide these problems and shove them under the rug when you have a mayor who is really part of the ascendant progressive base, illiberal leftist base. And I don't see how the anti-cop, anti-order left base mayor is going to allow for the kind of control and stage management that Democrats would normally have, the discipline that Democrats would normally have. And so consequently, I think what we're going to see at the convention is going to illustrate the literal struggle and fight that's at the core of the Democrat Party right now, which I think progressives are winning and going to win in a landslide if they're not already there. And I think you see it in the policies of a Biden administration that would have been unthinkable if Joe Biden had been president 8 years ago, 12 years ago, 20 years ago. But nevertheless, I don't see how they're going to keep a lid on it. And in fact, the Free Press did some reporting a couple of weeks back in April, basically observing the hundreds of activists who were planning on shaking up that convention. So it's going to be like 1968, except there's no Mayor Daley this time. And the Democrat machine is not the machine that it once was. And consequently, I think this should be great transparency for the American people to see the party that runs more than half the country in action.
Yeah, we're gonna move to final thoughts, but speaking of the elder Mayor Daley, his son William actually gave some quotes to the Washington Post about his anticipation that there will be similar protests this time around as 68, and he said that he does expect them to get violent, but he doesn't think it'll be quite as bad. So we'll see if his prediction comes true. He had a front row seat to the 68 convention, so should be interesting. But my final thoughts are just going to be on, really quickly, all of the controversy surrounding Christine Ohm's book. There's been quite a few things that she's been attacked for, from the way she put down her apparently unruly dog, to the claim that she had met Kim Jong-un while she was a member of Congress and some other world leaders. She's since edited the book to remove that. But just in general, regarding her PR strategy surrounding this, people have sort of been questioning why she keeps self-flagellating and going on these interviews. It's almost like a weird humiliation ritual. But I just wanted to remind people of how she handled the controversy surrounding her veto of the women's sports bill that was brought from the South Dakota legislature to keep men out of women's sports. And she handled it pretty much precisely the same way. She accused her critics of not understanding her position. She went on all of these interviews trying to defend herself. She had an interview on Tucker Carlson back when he still had his primetime Fox show, and just kind of talked around in circles, trying to defend herself and ultimately making the problem way, way worse. She repeatedly claimed that she was not opposing the bill for economic reasons, but then explicitly said that she was worried the NCAA was either going to pull tournaments that bring a lot of money to South Dakota from the state, or they were going to sue her and she was going to have to use taxpayer money to defend South Dakota, which are obviously both economic concerns. So I think this is just the only way she knows how to handle criticism. But the fact that she is so willing to really, I think, gaslight even conservatives who have a problem with some of the untruths that she's told, some of the falsehoods that were in her book, or even some of her actions politically in terms of the women's sports bill, is troublesome and probably not a indication of a good leader.
Yeah, couldn't have happened to a nicer governor on the GOP side, as far as I'm concerned. Her self-disqualification has made me very happy for all the reasons that Amber laid out, for all the serious political reasons. So I'm happy that her national political career appears to be deader than the dog that she shot in the gravel pit. My final thought, however, is speaking of these protesters, they hit the Met Gala yesterday, and hit a bunch of places up along the east side of Central Park. Now, it was partially amusing to watch them hit the Met Gala, but what was not amusing is the thing they did afterwards or before. I'm not really sure on which direction they came from, which is, if you continue up from the Met on that side of the park, there is one of my absolute favorite memorials in New York City, a beautiful and touching statue of dedicated to World War I, Americans who fought and died in World War I, from the state and the city of New York. And it is one of the really visceral memorials. I always stop when I walk there. It's just like one of my favorite. Of course, they spray painted it. They spray painted Gaza all over it. They burned an American flag at the base of it. And I don't know, this just shows, as we mentioned earlier, that this ideology is only tangentially about what's happening in the Middle East, about Israel and Gaza. That's the current Hydra head that's springing out of that organization, that sort of leftist agitation organization, Hydra, that Ben so well laid out for us, and that Park McDougal lays out in his piece in Tablet. And ultimately, those sentiments run the ultimate sort of receptor of those sentiments. The ultimate base of it is a hatred for America, for the West. In this case, showing itself by vandalizing war memorials and burning the American flag.
Yeah, my final thought is, I saw a picture today that was from the Columbia protest, where it was one of the janitors accosting one of the protesters, and there was somebody who pointed out that the protester was a trust fund billionaire who owns a $3.4 million house in Brooklyn, And the janitor is a guy who's working for $19 an hour. He's been doing so for 5 years, and he's the defender of civilization. And the trust fund millionaire is the one tearing it down. It's like we've inverted noblesse oblige on its head entirely. The rich aren't expected to treat people with basic respect and decency, but rather, because of their enlightenment, are tasked with destroying where good people are working here in some vague hope of serving some abstract cause halfway around the globe. It's insane. It's disgusting. And I really, the phenomena of these communist trust fund kids is just utterly embarrassing. They should donate their fortunes and give them to and put their money where their mouth is, literally.
And it's worth noting this is a recurring character throughout American history of the children, grandchildren of the elites who end up supporting generally left-wing causes or anarchist causes aimed at destroying the very values and principles and the country itself that gave their families so much. People should check out Paul Kanger's book, Dupes, which talks about many of these children dating back to the 30s when it came to the Soviet Union. And now we see it today with what Lee Smith calls the Empire of Palestine, which is really sort of the vanguard of the push against America and the West at the end of the day. That point aside, I always think it's instructive to actually look at what Palestinian Arabs themselves say, since basically U.S. foreign policy has been held hostage to the purported concerns of Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, as part and parcel of bigger concerns about basically the Biden administration's desire to be on the side of Iran and all of its proxies in the Middle East. There was recent opinion polling done by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is really one of the only organizations that does comprehensive polling both in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria. And I just want to read a few points from this poll from April 2024, points that seem to be totally removed from any conversation of the Biden administration, of the UN, as the UN is going to push for the establishment of a Palestinian state. Really, across all of our commentary and our policymaking class, there is almost zero acknowledgement of any of these figures. So just a few of them. So this is among all Palestinian Arabs. 71% say Hamas's decision to launch the October 7th attack was correct. That's up 14% in Gaza. So among the people who are supposedly the biggest victims of Hamas in Gaza since December of 2023. 70% are satisfied with Hamas's performance in the war, highest among all options between Hamas, its leader Sinwar, the party leading the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, which gets a mere 27%, and then Fatah's leader, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the PA, Mahmoud Abbas. 91% think Hamas did not commit war crimes during the Israel-Hamas war. 59% want Hamas to control the Gaza Strip after the war, and that includes 52% in the Gaza Strip. So more than half of the people in the Gaza Strip want Hamas to control Gaza after the war. The very people who elected Hamas and put them in power now almost 20 years ago. And then this one's for the Biden administration, which talks about the day after and the imperative of a two-state solution. 73% of Palestinian Arabs oppose a, quote, long-term vision for the day after in which the U.S. and an Arab coalition comprising Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan would develop a plan to strengthen the PA, restore negotiations based on the two-state solution, and bring about an Arab-Israeli peace and normalization. Furthermore, 63%, so nearly two-thirds, say no when asked if during negotiations Israel agrees to make painful concessions to the Palestinian side. Would you be willing in this case to support a similar Palestinian position in offering similar concessions to Israel? Those are the damning numbers that should put the nail in the coffin of the entire Biden administration policy. Yet all of the policy and all of the rhetoric, basically throughout governments in the West and many governments in the Middle East as well, is all of the rhetoric and all of the policy is totally unmoored from what the Palestinian Arabs are telling us themselves. And that is a remarkable statement. And I'm going to continue to update these poll numbers over time because I think they're so telling about how removed the conversation is in America from what the people on the ground actually want.
All right. Thanks everyone for your final thoughts. And that's going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Ben, Will, and Inez, I'm Amber Duke, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.